I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for your testimony today. This week, you stated that the Fed will, quote, stay the course until the job is done, and that is to restore price stability. This is positive, but you know as well as I do, you're facing a very strong headwind from the political left. Democrats are pressuring the Fed to stray from its narrow mandate. It's a page out of their same old progressive playbook. When they don't have the votes to achieve something here in Congress, they turn to regulators. And now, Chair Powell, they're looking at you in the Federal Reserve. President Biden's kowtowing to the far left is what got us into this inflationary mess. I urge you to reject the ideologues who put their social agenda ahead of economic prosperity. High prices continue to eat away at workers' wages and retirees' incomes. Since President Biden took office, we've experienced inflation at rates not seen since the late 70s and early 80s. Inflation rapidly accelerated after Democrats passed their so-called American Rescue Plan, which poured nearly $2 trillion of inflationary fuel into the economy. By June of last year, the Consumer Price Index showed inflation skyrocketed from below 2% to nearly 9%. And personal consumption expenditures, the Fed's preferred measure of consumer prices, ballooned to 7%. Instead of being rescued by Democrats, Americans were punished with pain at the grocery store and sticker shock at the pump. While inflation is now below its mid-2022 peak, it is persisting at rates well above the Fed's target. It remains broad-based and continues to hammer Americans' pocketbooks. In fact, a recent Gallup poll shows half of the respondents say they are worse off financially than a year ago. It's clear that there's still a long way to go in the effort to bring down costs. I look forward to hearing you reaffirm your commitment to that work today. Republicans also want to hear from you regarding some concerning developments at the Federal Reserve on the regulatory front. Recently, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision announced a quote-unquote holistic review of bank capital in the Fed's regulatory regime. However, it seems that only a small group within the Fed knows what this means, what it entails, how much review is being vetted by the full board, and the type of quantitative analysis the Fed is performing. The Fed shouldn't operate in the shadows, especially when the regulation in question can have broad and significant economic effects. It's also unclear the motivation for the Fed's holistic review, particularly when so many board members have stated that the banking system is very well capitalized, and any review of capital standards should be targeted. It also appears the Federal Reserve Board is laying the groundwork for climate policy to be implemented through the Fed regulation with an opening salvo to quote-unquote scenario analysis. Addressing an issue like climate change is important, but a policy that should originate here in Congress by the elected representatives of the people, not the central bank. As you said, the Fed needs to stick to its knitting. I agree. There is concern from many that the Fed is picking up new needles and knitting partisan sweaters. At such a precarious time for our economy here at home and the global economy, that would be a mistake. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony and the questions by our members. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Waters, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chair Powell. Since your last visit, our country, under the leadership of President Biden, has made major progress to improve economic conditions, including adding a record 12 million jobs, reducing unemployment to its lowest rate in 54 years, while also reducing the deficit by $1.7 trillion. Unfortunately, many families are still struggling to afford basic necessities because of inflation. What's more, interest rate hikes are making borrowing, especially for mortgages, outrageously expensive. Since I raised this concern for you in a November letter, the rate hikes continue to have an outsized impact on housing costs, which are, as you know, a primary driver of core inflation. But, Mr. Chair, I think that you will agree that Congress also has a role. That's why I'm somewhat disappointed that after 2 months, Republicans have taken no serious action to address inflation. By this time last Congress, House Democrats had passed the American Rescue Plan to provide relief from the ongoing pandemic, which included our committee's efforts to provide $70 billion for homeowners, renters, businesses, and first responders. If Republicans are looking for ideas, committee Democrats have put forth additional bills, like the Build Back Better Act, to bring down costs for Americans, especially housing costs. Even more concerning, we're just months away from an economic catastrophe beyond what we have ever seen, including spiking interest rates, massive job losses, and global instability. I'm talking about the threats by Republican leadership to force a default on our nation's debt if we don't agree to their demands to cut Social Security, Medicare, or other critical programs. You've urged Congress to take immediate action to raise the debt ceiling. But rather than focusing on this very real issue, the first bill that committee Republicans brought to the floor instead suggested that Social Security and Medicare are socialist threats to America. Since then, we have considered legislation related to deregulating securities and banking laws and countering threats from China, but Republicans have completely ignored the biggest economic threat to businesses, consumers, and our economy, defaulting on our debt. Last month, I wrote a letter to Chair McHenry urging him to take this matter seriously and hold a hearing, but I'm still waiting for a response. I hope Republicans will listen today to the real consequences that even the mere threat of a default would have for everyone in this country. And finally, I'm so pleased that we're finally making progress on diversity and inclusion for key positions at the Fed, including last year's historic confirmation of Dr. Lisa Cook to serve as the very first Black woman on the Federal Reserve Board, with the board's vice chair and Kansas City Fed president positions vacant. I think President Biden and Kansas City Fed Board should build on this progress by seriously considering diverse candidates for these positions. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The ranking member yields back the balance of my time, asking unanimous consent to submit for the record my letter to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen from February 28th, asking for an update on the ex-date for the debt ceiling. I also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the latest CBO long-term budget outlook on the unsustainability of our debt, most recently released. And without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize the Chair of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today to discuss the Federal Reserve's monetary policy actions in a time of economic uncertainty, mixed economic data, historic inflation that continues to plague families and businesses around the country. It is paramount that the Federal Reserve remain vigilant on reducing inflation, anchoring inflation expectations, and restoring price stability at the Fed's 2% target. I also look forward to discussing the Fed's regulatory and supervisory activities. As the Fed reviews the bank capital framework, it needs to consider the impact to the real economy and our global competitiveness when raising capital requirements and sidelining capital would work at cross purposes with monetary tightening, constraining the supply side when we need more, not less, investment to fix supply chains and reduce inflation. Tailored regulations are required of the Fed by law, and a one-size-fits-all approach would be the wrong path to take. Finally, I urge the Fed, in your words, to stick to its knitting and not attempt to be a climate regulator. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, for 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here today. Today is the 15th anniversary of when I was first elected to Congress and placed on the Financial Services Committee, just as the economy was about to collapse. And so that was my trial by fire, the emergency response to rescue the economy and the legislative response, the Dodd-Frank Act, that successfully stabilized our financial system. So 15 years later, as I take my place as the ranking member on the Committee of Oversight over U.S. banking and monetary policy, I recall the solemn oath that I swore to myself back then to make sure that this kind of calamity never happens again. The monetary policy report that we're receiving today is largely a narrative of a return to normal. Lead times to manufacturers are back to pre-COVID levels. The job market retains supernatural strength, and inflation is responding more or less as predicted to the usual measures. And by far, the largest threat on the horizon is a repeat of the 2011 default crisis. Congress has the power to avoid that, and we owe it to the American people to do so. And I yield back.